Morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be speaking at this Munich Science Communication Lab Colloquium. My name is Siddharth, as Julia introduced me, and I'm an independent consultant working in India, and I work across the intersection of science, society, and justice. Today, I want to talk to you about scientific temper, which is a post-colonial concept in India, but it also offers an alternative framework of thinking about science-society relationships. And I want to take all of you on a journey to understand what exactly is scientific temper. Before I do, I just want to give you some context that in the last few decades, there have been lots of frameworks and models to understand how science and society, elements, actors, processes interact with each other. There are models like deficit, like dialogue, like participation, which I'm sure you all have heard, which tries to sort of make a framework or a model or a conceptualization of how science and society interact with each other. And this is one of the most significant areas of research in science communication research in STS. And I think but something that's really interesting is that all of these models have been derived from Western or global North context and cultures and processes. And I think it's in this background that I really want to talk about scientific temper because it offers an alternative way of looking at science society relationships. From a global south perspective, from a global south example. And there are many more, and I'm just presenting to you one. But I think that's the context that I want you to remember and that I'm going to try and take you through in the next 25 minutes to convince you that there is something to investigate further in this concept called scientific temper. Now, before I begin, I do want to give a caveat that scientific temper is a concept that's really well known in India. It's a very commonly used term and concept in India's education, policy, socio-cultural context. But I would also argue that it has changed and warped and morphed into something very different in the last 6 or 7 decades since India became independent. And what I'm trying to present to you is to present it from the perspective of science communication, how it can really offer us a perspective or a way of looking at the world, which helps us understand how science and society interact. So I'm trying to go back to the original idea and conception of scientific temper rather than how it has been deployed and implemented in India in the current day and age, right? So there are bits and pieces which are actively in operation in India, and there are bits and pieces which I am proposing that should be the case it is deployed. So I also want to state that before we begin. Um, right. So to begin to talk about scientific temper, the idea that I'm going to present to you is that what does it mean for citizens to engage with science, not as passive receivers or listeners or someone who are getting bits of information about science, but as critical and empowered participants, right? So that's the idea that I want to really focus on today. All right. So let's get started. All right. So before I talk about what is scientific temper, and I want to share some historical context. And this historical context, although brief, is very important for understanding where and how the scientific concept, scientific temper, come about in India. Right. So scientific temper is a term that was coined by the first Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru in 1946. Remember that India got independence from British colonization in 1947, and he wrote this book called The Discovery of India, which is quite a seminal piece of work in understanding India. Just a year, it was published just a year before India became independent. So this concept was just proposed at the cusp of Indian independence, and I think that context is important as we go forward. Now, Nehru really wanted to sort of propose something which was a counterweight to centuries of colonial and religious oppression, exploitation, legacies. And there was a country which had 2 centuries of British colonial occupation. It was deeply divided along religious, class, caste, and linguistic lines. It was also plagued by a number of socio-cultural issues, including superstitions, including pseudoscience, a lot of irrational religious dogmatic practices. So, in this context, Nehru really wanted a way or a philosophy of life and knowledge which was not just about understanding science, but also trying to undo and move beyond these colonial histories or legacies that India was emerging from as a newly independent post colonial state. So scientific temper was proposed by Nehru in the context of being a philosophy rather than just a concept that enables people to make informed decisions and reject irrational beliefs, right? So this was the social cultural context of India, which was really important in why Nehru proposed the concept of scientific temper. And he envisaged or he imagined that scientific temper would have a crucial role to play in building a rational, a secular, which is non-religious or which does not differentiate between people on the basis of religion or non-belief in religion, and a democratic post-independence India, right? So, with this historical context in place, let's try, and also lastly, scientific temper, about 30 years after being proposed by Nehru in his book, was listed in the Indian Constitution as a fundamental duty of every Indian citizen to try and incorporate a way of thinking scientifically about things. So, scientific temper became such an important concept in India that it was listed in the Indian Constitution as a fundamental duty of all citizens, right? So, this just goes on to show how important of a concept scientific temper was in India's development as a post colonial state, so much so that it was listed in our Constitution as a fundamental duty for every citizen. Now, with this brief historical context, I want to really get into what I'm really here to propose and talk to you about today, which is what is scientific temper, right? It sounds really fancy, but what does it really mean? So, scientific temper is nothing but an approach that values reason, rationality, evidence, and the freedom to question. Now, this is not something which is unique to India or to scientific temper. This pursuit of rationality, of reason, of evidence based thinking, of the freedom to question, of critical thinking is something that we see across the world. But it is the particular juxtaposition or deployment of scientific temper in the specific context of post colonial India that makes it unique. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on. Scientific temper fosters a shared culture of skepticism, of inquiry, and critical thinking. Now, this is really important, as I said, that there was a lot of religious dogma, of superstition, of irrational beliefs in India. And in order to overcome all of that, Nehru envisaged that we needed science and technology to, develop Indian society, but we also needed a philosophy of knowledge and of life to sort of understand how do we deal with day-to-day interactions in our life, and how do we build a process of thinking critically, which can help us navigate our life on a day-to-day basis, right? So scientific temper as a concept rejects superstition, it rejects dogma, and it rejects unquestioned authority, which basically means that it forces you or it encourages you to question everything around you, which includes science and scientific institutions, but also social, political, economic, and cultural institutions, right? So as I will explain later, scientific temper is not just about learning about scientific concepts or scientific knowledge. It's about incorporating a process of thinking scientifically, of incorporating critical thinking, and to question things around you, not just within the realm of science, but also within the realm of society. And this is the critical differentiator which makes scientific temper a tool for making citizens empowered. And I will explain to this later as well. So the idea of scientific temper was to invoke the scientist in every citizen. So every citizen has a way of being a scientist, not by literally working in a lab or by doing science in a government institution, but by looking at the world through a scientific lens, and by questioning things and using the method and process of science to make sense of the world around them, right? So it invoked the scientist in every citizen, but more importantly, it also invoked the citizen in every scientist, right? So scientific temper really encouraged the civic aspect or the civic participation or the democratic participation of every citizen in the processes, in the institutions, in the actors of democracy, of society, of things around them, right? And as I will explain a little bit later in the talk, this aspect of building and empowering citizens actually is a very important component of scientific temper, which makes it a tool for building a deliberative and democratic citizenry as well, right? So it's about invoking the citizen in every scientist and the scientist in every citizen. And I want you to remember this through the end of the talk, and I will bring it back later. As I said, scientific temper was a concept that emphasized civic engagement and democratic participation, and it empowered citizens to be able to be critical agents of change, to be engaged participants in social processes and actors around them, and to be sort of active participants in the pursuit of democracy rather than just being passive receivers of knowledge or of information or whatever it is in a democracy, right? So I want to pause here at this point and ask if there are any questions. Does everybody understand what I'm saying? Is everybody with me? If you have any questions, I can take questions, maybe one question, and then move on. Anyone? All right. Right. So let's move on. So I'm going to take a bit of pause and go back to maybe a brief history of existing psycho models. Now, before I go on, I want to ask, is everybody aware of the deficit, dialogue, participation models of science communication? I'm guessing it's a science communication lab and you all are already experts on this. So I won't really go into the details of that, but I'll just briefly touch upon it because I want to differentiate scientific temper from other science communication models. So I'll briefly take you on a journey of what these models are. The first thing I want to remind you again is that all of these models, the deficit, the dialogue, and the participation models, were mostly developed and envisaged within Western global North context. Whether it was the BSE scandal in the UK, which pushed people to think of the deficit model, whether it was the nanotechnology and the GM crop controversies in Europe that taught people to think about dialogue and participation, or whether it was more stem cell related, controversies that thought made people think about participation models. Most of these developments have happened in the global north or in the developed nations, as we say. So the trajectory of existing models is not really linear. I have put the arrows in a linear fashion, but they develop more or less overlapping each other. But there is some linearity in terms of the deficit model being the first to develop in the UK. Then the dialogue model came in. So the deficit model was basically a unidirectional flow of information, which thought that publics were deficient in knowledge and they were in need of understanding or being told scientific information, and then there were empty vessels that needed to be filled with scientific information. Next, we had the dialogue model, which encouraged a more bi-directional way of communicating, where citizens were encouraged to understand science and scientific concepts and contexts, but scientists were also encouraged to learn about publics and their context in order to better understand what the dialogue model is. And then the next model was participation model, which encompassed models like citizen science, like upstream engagement, also thinking about the responsible research and innovation framework. So participation model basically said that citizens or publics are basically active stakeholders in science and they need to be involved in the process of science, or they need to be involved in the direction and the speed at which techno-scientific developments are occurring. Now, what's interesting is that we think about these models in terms of the trajectory from deficit, dialogue, and participation. But let's take a step back and think about these models and how they envisage or how they imagine publics. In the deficit models, publics were imagined as passive listeners, that they did not have agency, they were listening and taking in information, they were absorbing information. In the dialogue model, they were given a little bit more agency and they became engaged stakeholders where their context and their histories and their cultures became important for scientists to understand. And in the participation model, publics were imagined as active participants in the process and in the deliberation of science, and then they became active participants, right? But in all of these sort of conceptualizations of the public, there are some really hidden hierarchies that I want to highlight, right? So despite this progressive improvement in giving more space and agency and power to the publics, from passive listeners to engaged stakeholders to active participants, there are still hidden hierarchies and power structures that remain within all of these models, right? And that's what I want to highlight before I go into scientific temper again. Right. So where do these models fall short, right? What are some of the deficiencies or hidden hierarchies? The first deficiency I want to highlight is that each of these models implicitly imagine that there is a science and public binary, that scientists and publics are separate entities, and there is a need to bridge the gap between these two, right? This is in stark opposition to the model of scientific temper, which, as I said before, is trying to invoke the scientist in every citizen and the citizen in every scientist. So, in some ways, it is not really differentiating scientists from citizens. It's seeing as all citizens as part of society, of our culture, and it's trying to develop skills and competencies of every citizen rather than defining or describing them as a science and public binary. Is everybody with me? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So in all of these three models, deficit, dialogue, and participation, there is an implicit imagination of science and public being a binary. And while the science public binary is convenient and useful for conceptualizing and theorizing science communication frameworks, it also comes with a set of limitations and drawbacks, right? In which you're always framing publics and scientists on an unequal footing, and you're always trying to, give more agency and power to the publics. And scientists are always imagined to be here, and citizens are always imagined to be here. But as we know today, with a lot of wicked problems like planetary health, like climate change, like sustainability, conservation, we're increasingly finding that citizens or stakeholders in different kinds of problems also have a lot of information, knowledge, expertise that is equally important to consider. I'm not saying that all the forms of expertise are equal to scientific expertise, but these forms of expertise are equally important to consider and acknowledge and to bring into the conversation if we really want to solve these big global planetary problems, right? So I hope everybody is with me on that. The second area, the second drawback where these models fall short is that they're constantly framing publics as deficient. They're either deficient in knowledge, or they're deficient in access to science or scientific information, or they're deficient in legitimacy in terms of who is an expert and who gets to really pitch into the problem or be able to speak towards solving a problem, right? So all the publics are always framed as deficient. And this framing of publics as deficient also comes with a set of cognitive and epistemic biases, which also leads to a lot of problems, as I will tell you more about later. The third problem that I want to highlight is that all of these models also reproduce certain epistemic sort of concepts of science, which proposes that science is neutral, it's apolitical, it's a tool for modernity, and it's a solution to all the problems that we are facing. Right now, science being proposed as neutral, apolitical, a tool for modernity, has shot us in the leg multiple times. And I don't need to give you examples. I mean, nuclear weapons is one. Finding there are so many problems, climate change, planetary health, where the pursuit of science as always being superior and always being the solution to everything has caused a lot of problems, right? And as we are increasingly seeing in today and what's happening in the US, for example, science is no longer apolitical. It is very much political. It is very much a tool for colonization, historically speaking. It has been proposed as a tool for modernity, but it also causes a lot of harms if it is not checked or if it is not viewed critically. And as scholars of science and technology studies, I think this is something that all of you would appreciate more than anybody else, that science needs to be viewed with a critical lens. With a lens of criticality as much as any other field, right? So these models also reproduce epistemic biases of science being neutral, apolitical, and a tool for modernity, which, as we know, is not right and not always correct. Um, as I said, these models have been developed in the global now. And when we try to take these models to global south context, like India, like Aborigine in Australia, like Africa, often there are a lot of challenges that we face. So there is a lot of incompatibility with applying and translating these models into global south context directly without any sort of mediation or facilitation. And this is something I can speak with some expertise because I was trained in the UK. I studied science communication in the UK. I went back to India. I was really happy and excited that I'm going to apply all of these new learnings in the Indian context. And I fell on my face and I failed miserably because I realized that just uh, sort of taking global north models and putting them in global south context does not always work. You really need to unlearn and relearn a lot of things. You really need to think about context, local knowledge systems, local cultures before you can really implement these models, right? So these models are also incompatible with global south context if they are uncritically translated and applied in those contexts without thinking. Um, Often, these models also reproduce hierarchies of science as being the only valid way of knowing and understanding the world. And this is also problematic as we are learning today that there are many ways of understanding the world. There are many indigenous knowledge systems. There are many local socio-cultural practices, which can teach us a lot about living more sustainably, about conserving our natural resources better, about living in ways which are not always neo-capitalistic. So understanding that there are many different ways of understanding the world, that there are lots of learnings that we can learn from different ways of different knowledge systems and epistemic knowledge systems and indigenous ways of knowing the world is also important. Lastly, many of these models also fail to interrogate power, coloniality, and erasure of local knowledge systems. As we know, the history of colonization was often built on erasure of local knowledge systems, of sort of suppressing ways of doing things, of living in local context, and superimposing sort of European knowledge systems on them. And these science communication models often don't do enough to question and interrogate these power systems, colonial systems of oppression, and the erasure, the historical erasure of local knowledge systems as well. So these are just a few things that I'm showcasing, not necessarily to criticize the global north frameworks of science communication, but just to say that these are not perfect. There are lots of gaps and uh, things that these systems don't consider, and perhaps we need a little bit more to fill these gaps and move ahead, right? So why do we need something different? um, excuse me. All right. So there is a need for reconciling global south epistemologies and lived experiences, which a lot of these global north models and frameworks have not been able to do very well so far. There's also a need to move from public ignorance and deficiencies, basically framing publics as ignorant and deficient in knowledge, access, or legitimacy, to actually acknowledging that there have been systemic forms of exclusion, there have been systemic and structural inequities, and there has been marginalization of actors, processes, and knowledge systems that have happened for various reasons. And it's not always the fault of different stakeholders and publics that they are not proficient in different forms of scientific knowledge, right? There are lots of structural and systemic reasons for what's happening, and it's important to acknowledge those as well, and not just frame publics as being ignorant and deficient. There is a need for more decolonial, reflexive, and citizen-led frameworks. And I'll explain how scientific temper achieves all of these things in a way that works. Um, Also, before I move on, I want to clarify that scientific temper is not a panacea, is not a solution to all the problems that I've highlighted so far. What I'm proposing is that it is a powerful and complementary tool for rethinking science communication and science society relationships that could be really valuable in addition to the deficit dialogue and participation models. So, what I'm going to propose today in my talk is not to replace these frameworks and ways of connecting science and society, but rather to add scientific temper as a complementary way of envisaging or imagining science society relationships. Um, so scientific temper encompasses all of these in several ways, and I'll explain this later. So let's look at a few features of scientific temper. And I know that I'm crossing 30 minutes, so I'll wrap up quickly. So there are many features of scientific temper which are desirable and which offer a subaltern or an alternative way of thinking about science-society relationships. Now, I want to go through five of these which I think are critical. The first one is process-based thinking or critical thinking and skepticism. We live in an age where there is a lot of post-truth tendencies. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation. We are operating in really complex digital media ecosystems, and the need for having critical skills of being able to be skeptical, to inculcate rationality and process-based thinking is something that's becoming increasingly important. And scientific temper, by definition, incorporates a process-based way of thinking of not just the world around us, but also questioning science and scientific institutions and questioning the validity of different forms of knowledge and making sure that people only believe something when they have critically evaluated against evidence and not just believing it because someone else is saying it. Um, Scientific tempo also offers us a citizen centric drive and agenda. So, a lot of the times when deficit dialogue participation models, we see that the drive and agenda for science communication activities and initiatives is often led by scientific institutions and actors, right? It's the scientists or the scientific institutions or scientific societies which are pushing people to engage with science, which are communicating science, or which are organizing activities and initiatives. But in contrast, scientific temper does not always see scientists going and propagating scientific temper as a model. It's basically the citizens realizing that they need a way to assess the world around them. And the drive and the agenda for making sense of the world is very citizen centric. So let me give you an analogy. So we can give antibiotics to people to fight misinformation and disinformation by giving them antibiotics of what is the correct scientific explanation for a fact, or we can vaccinate them and teach them the process of understanding the world, of evaluating knowledge claims, of being able to assess what is evidence based and what is not. So basically, the analogy is that either you can give them antibiotics post facto when they're already drowning in misinformation and disinformation, or you can vaccinate them prior to being exposed to misinformation and teach them a process based way of thinking about the world, which enables them to make sense of the world on their own rather than requiring fact checkers and scientists to intervene all the time, right? So I hope the analogy between antibiotics and vaccines is clear. It's just an analogy, so if it doesn't work for you, that's fine. Scientific tempo also incorporates reflexive thinking and circularity. So basically, it pushes us to blur the difference between scientists and citizens. So it blurs the science and public boundaries. It also blurs the linear relationship between science and science communication. So historically, we always say that science is the originator of knowledge, where all the knowledge is generated, and science communication is the place where all of that knowledge is taken and then propagated or disseminated to the world, and there is a linear and deterministic uh, direction to science feeding into science communication. But what scientific tempo allows us or enables us to do is that citizens and science communication activities could also be sites of knowledge production, of insights, of expertise, of lived experiences, which can then feed back into science to either inform science, to assess scientific claims, to feed into new hypotheses or questions that science needs to investigate. So it's also breaking the linearity between science and science communication and making it a little bit more circular and reflexive, right? Um, Fourthly, scientific temper embodies within it the concept of deliberative citizenry. So when citizens start thinking in a more process-based way, they're empowered to become more active participants in understanding scientific things, and they become more critical and reflexive. They also start becoming reflexive of not just science and knowledge, but also social systems around them, political system, cultural claims. So through scientific temper, citizens also become more informed, more engaged, and more critical agents of change. And they become critical of not just science and scientific institutions, but also social institutions, political institutions. And that makes them a more informed and engaged citizen in the pursuit of democracy. And this is something that scientific temper does not, has always embodied and strived for. Lastly, scientific tempo being a global south derived model and which has been uh, conceptualized, developed, and translated in a culture like India also offers many ways of decolonizing science and scientific knowledge. It embraces lived experiences, it embraces more pluralistic forms of knowledge, it allows more space for indigenous knowledge systems to operate as long as they can stand up to the scrutiny of evidence based ways of thinking. I'm not saying that every form of knowledge is acceptable, but if through evidence we can show that this works, and a prime example of this is Ayurveda or more local medicine systems that operate in India. And so basically, scientific tempo allows more avenues for decolonizing science and scientific knowledge systems. Right. So with this, I think I'll stop, and I just want to highlight a few future directions in terms of where I really want to go with this further. My first plea to all of you is to really think of scientific temper as a valid and legitimate framework for science-society relationships. Uh, Again, I want to reiterate that I'm not offering scientific temper as a replacement for global North-centric models like deficit dialogue and participation, but more as a supplementary or complementary or alternate framework which can sit alongside and parallel to these models and help us make better sense of science society relationships and interactions. um, Secondly, I feel like in order to really benefit from the offerings of scientific temper, we really need more work to apply it in more educational, policy, and civic engagement context. And this requires long-term education, pedagogy, policy work, and it will not happen overnight. It requires a sustained sort of agenda to, incorporate this within policy context as well. Um, I also want to highlight that scientific temper can have a lot of implications and applications in building resilience against misinformation and disinformation, and in fighting wicked planetary issues like climate change, sustainability, and degrowth. And I know that as the MSCL forum, this is of particular interest to you because these are questions and issues that you deal with on a daily basis. I also want to reiterate that scientific temper, although an idea originated from India, the core values of scientific temper are not unique to India. There are many more examples of these values being used and applied and conceptualized in different parts of the world, including global north context. So I would really like to study invocations of scientific temper and other similar framings across the globe using more situated research, ethnographies, and case studies. So I would urge all of you that if you have come across examples of something similar to scientific tempo in other contexts, I would love to chat more and see if we can really build this into a broader cross cultural and global South centric research agenda for decolonizing science. With that, I want to conclude and I want to reiterate that decolonizing knowledge means returning the power of inquiry to every citizen. And that's exactly what scientific temper does. It's about recentering science, not around experts, but around people, around epistemic justice, and around critical inquiry. Thank you so much. I will take questions.